Hello and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light on hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and this week we're looking at Iran's alleged use of hitmen to carry out kidnapping and murder plots in Europe and the United States to wage a proxy war against Israel. One of the most interesting parts of this story is that while these assassination plots were ordered by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, they were carried out by outsourced hitmen. Joining me in the studio is Cassell Bryan-Low, features editor at Reuters based in London, and one of the reporters who worked on Reuters' fascinating investigation into the plots. Welcome, Cassell.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess, when you think about foreign intelligence and like all of the shady things foreign intelligence does, like assassinate people and spy, we always kind of defer to the Western version, which is like, the CIA having people in disguise and blending in and non-official cover and things like that. But I feel like some of the work that you guys have done at Reuters really explores how some countries don't have all of those skills. I mean, like Iranians don't have a whole population of people that look like everybody else in the world. So they have to sort of think about more creative ways to do the dirty tricks of espionage. And so I just wondered if you could just kind of give us an overview of what it is that you were looking at specifically in this kind of case, these kind of assassinations.
What drew me to this was I was interested in how events in the Middle East were sort of playing out closer to home here in Europe and the US. And so we started to look at what Western authorities, Washington and its allies, were saying was increased, a sharp rise in assassination, abduction attempts in the West. And we started looking at that, and we started to spot patterns, clear patterns about how those were being carried out. And there were two key patterns. One was the targets. So primarily it was Iranian dissidents. They were aiming to target US officials and politicians and Israeli or Jewish civilians. And then the other key pattern was, as you were talking about, was the use of hired hitmen. So outsourcing many of these plots to, be it gang members, organized criminals, and in some instances, just sort of lone individuals.
So basically, Iran wants to be out in the world causing some mayhem related to its foreign policy, but they don't always want to have the IRGC operatives on the ground doing the work. So they're trying to find ways to kind of have no fingerprint. Is that the way?
Yes, so the two things. So IRGC operatives are allegedly sometimes involved. But what Washington will say is the advantage of outsourcing the work is that it gives you some plausible deniability in hopes that it makes it harder to trace back to the IRGC.
I suppose in some ways the inverse is true too, because there is a history of Iranian nuclear scientists and others who die mysteriously, and there's no one's taking credit for having killed them, I suppose. But so maybe they think that they're playing two sides of the same game.
Well, for its part, Iran would not only deny many of these alleged plots, but they would also say that some of their senior military and security figures have been killed by the US and Israel. So there's multiple sides to this.
So could you walk us through sort of the best example of one of these operations, and just kind of step by step, as best as you know it from the reporting you did?
What we found were there were more than 30 instances or cases over the last 4 or 5 years where Western authorities or Israel had alleged an Iran link. And so, as I said, there were certain patterns that emerge. And one case that we were able to get previously unreported detail on was an alleged plot in Greece. And so this was, the target was a sort of Jewish center and kosher restaurants sort of combined. And the alleged plot had a ringleader based in Iran, and what Greek authorities have alleged is that the ringleader recruited someone he knew who was living in Greece to help carry out an attack. They were planning to conduct an arson attack on the Jewish center.
And maybe you could explain a little bit more about what the investigators found. There was WhatsApp discussions and things like that. What was the exchanges like?
So we were fortunate enough to be able to review hundreds of pages of documents that were gathered in the pre-trial probe, and that included witness testimony, police statements, and as you mentioned, WhatsApp messages between the alleged ringleader sitting in Iran and his recruit in Greece. And some of the talk was very prosaic. It was talk about life back home. They were both from the same village in Pakistan. But then also talk turned to specifics of the type of plots, what kind of methods would they use, explosives, to, the specific target, and even how much the group behind the guy in Iran was willing to pay, sort of 15 or 16,000 euros per head per kill.
And obviously they were unsuccessful in carrying out that attack. I mean, Correct. Do you have the feeling from your reporting that Western security services are kind of on top of this to some extent? I mean, these things are getting foiled to some extent.
We certainly know the number that are allegedly being foiled. I guess I assume if others were going ahead and being successful, would be aware of them too, because places would be, exploding, people being killed. Israel's security service, Mossad, plus US intelligence and European intelligence are closely monitoring these and I imagine to a large degree sharing knowledge between them.
In this particular case, the guy on the ground in Greece, when did they manage to arrest him? Was that clear how they precipitated the arrest? From what we know from the court documents, the arrest was precipitated by an anonymous tip. An email came in. One can guess whether that was an intelligence agency of another country or not. We were never able to find out whether the tip came from, but that tip came before any attack was launched. That's fascinating.
And we do know that Israel's intelligence service, Mossad, assisted with the investigation.
That's in the court documents?
I think Israel said that publicly.
Okay, interesting.
And then it's Israel that has publicly alleged a link between this plot and Iran. Greek authorities have only said that they interrupted a terrorist plot that had a sort of multinational network. They've stopped short of publicly accusing Iran, but Israel has publicly alleged Iran was behind this, which Tehran denies. In the court documents, though, primarily those WhatsApp messages were probably from the Greek-based would-be attacker, right? He kept all the messages on his phone. So they arrested and charged two of the alleged operatives in Greece. Both have been released on from pretrial detention on restrictions, and the case is waiting for a judicial panel to decide whether it should go to trial. So yes, but they seized his and the other operative's phone after they arrested him. And so the WhatsApp messages between him, the alleged ringleader in Iran, and others. I like how, sometimes these WhatsApp exchanges show a kind of lack of skill in a way. So when one of the guys was saying there are secret agencies that are involved and make sure that you don't leave any room for complaint. It just seems like that's the kind of thing you shouldn't be saying in a WhatsApp message, But I guess the Iranian tradecraft is maybe not always that tidy. Well, it's interesting. There's talked about patterns that pop up in these dozens of other cases we looked at. And one is this idea that, I need proof to send to my bosses. So either proof or that you've been tailing, the target, or proof that the job has been done. I imagine that's standard practice for intelligence agencies, but that you see details like that crop up in a lot of these cases. Yeah. So what are some of the other cases that have emerged in the course of these, some more than 30 attempts? If I recall, there's a few that were in the US as well, right? Yes. There are others in Europe and in the US. If I start with Europe first, just because that's where the majority of the cases we looked at have taken place. There was a case actually in Germany that has gone to trial and has a lot of parallels with this case. In that instance, German court found that the Iranian state was behind the plot. That similarly involved someone in Iran directing someone on the ground in Germany to target, in that case, a synagogue in an arson attack, and those are all parallels. Another parallel is that the person in Iran is wanted for murder, the person who's the sort of alleged ringleader, and that, again, with this Greek case, the operative in Iran is also wanted for murder. So it gives you a flavour of the kind of characters involved. Then, as you say, there have been a number of cases in the US as well, including after the story was published, there have been charges announced against an Iranian who is alleged to have been involved in an IRGC plot to target Donald Trump.
I mean, does it feel to you almost like even though there is some plausible deniability by having these remote controlled thugs and things, it does seem like the trail is leading back to Iran pretty fast. I mean, maybe they don't actually want to make it that deniable even, you know?
I can't speak to what they want, but certainly I know that the view from law enforcement in the US is that they are having success in joining the dots back to revealing the connections back to Iranian officials. In that case, there was the case I just mentioned. They talk about links to the IRGC in another development post-publication of the story, but it relates to one of the cases we talk about. There have been fresh charges. In that instance, there was an IRGC official who's been charged. So the American law enforcement argue they are able to sort of pull back the veil of
pretty quickly. Secrecy. Yeah. I mean, it seems almost, I mean, the idea of hiring somebody through, this remote control effort to target Donald Trump, it seems kind of crazily reckless in a way, because let's say that by some chance he succeeded, I can't see how that would actually serve Iranian interests, because it would just precipitate a war against Iran. There would be no doubt about that, So I almost makes you wonder, and I wonder if anybody you spoke to gave you any kind of at least opinion of how they view this Iranian strategy. What was really there? I mean, did they actually want to carry that out, or do they want the person to get caught with that as the intent, or I don't know. Did you learn anything from experts on the IRGC?
I don't know what the IRGC is. I can't get inside their head, but there's I guess two things to say. One is you have to remember that Tehran has publicly vowed revenge against the US for the 2020 killing of one of the top Iranian commanders, Qasem Soleimani. And so that has been long a stated aim, to get revenge for that. And so it fits that Trump and some of his former officials, like John Bolton, the former national security advisor, have been targeted in some of these plots. One could also argue, even if it's the plot, doesn't realize in a death, there's still success there. You and I are sitting here talking about it now. Iran has, I guess caused concern, unsettlement in the West. Western intelligence is spending a lot of effort, I imagine, looking at these kinds of cases. So I think there's success there, even if they don't have a death.
Yeah, I think it's sort of just by attempting something like this, it implies that you're ambitious, that you would be willing to cross all those lines, even if it doesn't actually happen. Because a plot uncovered early on is not necessarily a cause for a war, but if, obviously somebody carries something out. That's fascinating. I would be really curious to hear about you and your colleagues. How did you kind of put this together? Like, what were some of the tools you were able to do? Because nobody's just guiding you straight to it.
As I mentioned, it started out as an interest in how events in the Middle East were playing out in the West, and started looking at quickly became clear there'd been, dozens of cases. So I was looking at that and sort of putting together a sort of spreadsheet, a tally of those and what were the patterns that those showed. And in doing so, I was talking to colleagues in the various countries where they've taken place. So that's, the US, UK, Georgia, Germany, and turned out some colleagues in Greece had access to court documents on the specific case there. So it made the perfect pairing with the very detailed documents they had about the Greek case and the sort of bigger picture of what's going on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then what about like, you know, what was the feeling you got from speaking to people who are at least familiar with the law enforcement perspective on this? I mean, was this kind of in their eyes an alarming change or shift in strategy for Iran, or was this just a continuation of something that has always been part of the playbook?
So Iran, since the 79 revolution, has made assassination attempts in the West. So that's a long-standing factor. But what officials in the West do talk about is the very sharp, what they can categorize as a sharp increase in these attempts since 2020, in the wake of the 2020 killing of the Iranian commander, Qasem Soleimani.
And you would think that what's happening in the Middle East right now would even be cause for even more of this kind of behavior, you would think, because not only have some of their allies been killed, like Hassan Nasrallah, but also I think some IRGC officials were killed in some of those bombings in Beirut. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Israeli actions in Gaza and in Lebanon are very inflammatory for the region, but especially for this sort of coalition between Hezbollah and Iran and people like that. So I would imagine this is kind of almost kind of a whack-a-mole situation for law enforcement right now.
Yeah, I would imagine that Iran will look to hit back in, whatever way it can. And what's interesting about some of these plots, including this Greek one, is there seems to be an element of opportunism there. And I guess that's another advantage of outsourcing your hits. But in this Greek case, it's actually there's sort of various amateurish elements to it. At one point, the recruit in Greece, under pressure to deliver on a scalp, convinces somebody else to dress themselves in clothes soaked in goat's blood and pretend to play dead so that he could video it and send it back to his bosses to convince them that he'd actually killed someone. They didn't fall for it, apparently. But so there's quite amateurish. Some of the other plots are more sophisticated, but what that tells me is there's an element of opportunism here.
Yeah. I think also maybe it feels like this kind of strategy from the Iranian government is obviously it's kind of a terrorizing strategy because the targets are kind of random. They're related to Jewish things or whatever it might be in countries. Whereas I suppose the inverse strategy is very targeted about individuals in the government. There's not attempts to kill Iranian people, the population, by the Israelis. But anyway, so it's kind of interesting to see. I think lacking the ability to be so precise, they're having to resort to more like terroristic activity.
I mean, I would just add that there is targeting there. It's I don't think it's an accident that they often target places where Jewish or Israeli citizens frequent. So the fact that it was a Jewish center or synagogues, I think that is targeted. And they are also targeting Iranian diaspora, so Iranian dissidents and activists based in the West. And I guess those activists would say that the Iranian regime is also targeting its own people in the way that it's clamped down on protests in recent years.
Is there an example in these more than 33 plots of like an actual success from their point of view, from the Iranian point of view?
These were all instances that were, I think they were all thwarted. The case in Germany, a Molotov cocktail was thrown at a building next to a synagogue, but it caused some minor damage rather than killing people. Yeah. So I'd sort of come back to the how do you measure success? Do you measure success in terms of causing concern, headlines, people talking about it, just instilling fear? And I think they're successful to agree in that sense, even if they haven't successfully killed people. I
feel like the obvious comparable situation is Russia with its own targeting of Russians, but also others. And I feel like they have a much more deadly history. There's lots of Russians who seem to fall off of tall buildings all the time. There was that one very gruesome assassination in a children's park in Germany, I believe, by a guy on a bicycle. I think he was part of the trade with Evan Gershkovich and everything. So does still feel like Iran hasn't quite, reached that level, I guess, in a sense.
They have had some success in terms of abducting Iranian dissidents abroad and taking them back to Iran. And I think they've executed at least one and given a death sentence to another. So there have been some success in that sense.
Yeah.
And I guess there have been US casualties, as you alluded to, of US individuals based in the, or military individuals based in the Middle East that have been targeted by Iran.
Or their proxies, yeah, exactly. Well, this is very fascinating. This is something that I feel like maybe is not quite well known enough, that this kind of thing is going on. I mean, in some ways, stories like this just make you realize that everyday life in Europe is not as clear-cut and safe as it seems. There's things happening below the surface. And I think there's also, seems to me to be this trend in general of using the ease of communication to inspire crimes, even if it's not necessarily always state-oriented. There's all these interesting cases now where people are sort of activated, even if they didn't realize that they were part of some sort of a criminal operation. And I think that this kind of feels like it relates to that a little bit with these kind of WhatsApp messages. People that previously had no work on behalf of Iran, now they're working for Iran.
I guess we don't know what their past history with Iran was, but certainly the operatives sitting in Greece, we didn't find a trace of Iranian state history. This was someone who arrived in Greece as a undocumented worker, was living in an apartment building with a bunch of other Pakistani nationals, was doing seasonal work, working in olive groves. So in that sense, he did seem to be recruited for this rather than having a long Iranian history. But certainly I agree with you that that's what struck with me about this story is what's going on around us here in our safe bubble in Europe that we're unaware about. And that also extends to Russian killings, explosions, various things that hit the headlines.
Yeah, like all the stuff that was happening around the Olympics, like the kind of random sabotage and everything like that. So, well, anyways, thank you so much for joining us and sharing more about this with us.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this week. Thanks to Cassell for joining us. You can find her story by searching Murder for Hire Inside Iran's Proxy War with Israel in the West, or by clicking the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week.
Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Binaikia. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.